Hello and welcome to today's webinar on using newspapers in your genealogical research. My name is Ginevra Morse, the Director of Education and Online Programs at the New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'll be moderating today's event. NEHGS is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer this webinar today for our members and friends around the world. Giving today's presentation is Rhonda McClure, genealogist at NEHGS. Rhonda is a nationally recognized professional family historian and lecturer specializing in New England and celebrity research, as well as computer genealogy. She's been at the Society for close to 9 years and helps patrons and members at our research library and archives in Boston. Her areas of expertise include immigration and naturalization, late 19th and early 20th century urban research, New England, Midwest, Southern, German, Italian, Scottish, Irish, French Canadian, and New Brunswick research. In today's presentation, Rhonda will discuss what kinds of information and announcements that you're likely to find in newspapers, what types of newspapers exist, tips for effective searching, and finally, how to find or locate those newspapers. At any point during the presentation, feel free to type your question in the panel to the right of your screen. We'll address those after the presentation. We don't have a handout for this webinar, but you will be able to review a recording of the presentation starting tomorrow on our website. Also, during the broadcast, you can click an icon that looks like a little camera. It should be in the upper right of your screen, and that way you can capture any of the content that you see on your computer screen and save it to your computer. If you don't see the camera icon or the question panel, you can expand or minimize your user panel by clicking on the icon that looks like a white arrow with an orange background. All right, so I think without further ado, I will turn things over to Rhonda.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Newspapers are one of my favorite things to discuss, largely because I think people don't understand truly what's hiding in them. So we're going to get right into it and start out with, why are we going to use the newspapers in the first place? Well, newspapers record the fine print of our daily lives. I like to say that they're sort of a snapshot of what was going on at that exact moment in the community, whether it is, the town on up to the nation or the world. But more importantly, it is a look at everything that was going on, whether it's through ads or whatever. You're going to get a good idea of how your ancestor lived in that area. And when you're working in newspapers, it's best to start your search locally and then expand up to larger cities, counties, state, region, and then national levels, because each newspaper is likely to have different information. What can you find in a newspaper? Births, marriages, deaths, anniversaries, obituaries, memorials, legal notices of all manner, court notices, police blotters, that's where my ancestors always hang out, the gossip and society news and the social events. Sometimes you'll get some great biographical or historical pieces, and then news about the churches, fraternal, ethnic groups, whatever was going on in the community. So basically, anything and everything that was going on in a community, whether it be the town, the city, or whatever, you're likely to find some indication. One of the things that we use the newspapers for, though, as the biggest thing, the reason that people turn to newspapers in the first place, of course, is as that vital record alternative. There are all too often times where a particular community wasn't keeping the vital records, and we need to augment that in some way. And sometimes the newspaper may be easier to find than perhaps a church record if you don't know the religion. So newspapers can sometimes supply you with the news of births, marriages, and deaths, but more importantly, and the things that you're more apt to find that will give you the necessary information, are announcements of things like the wedding anniversaries, those big milestone ones like the 25th and the 50th, obituaries or memorials or funeral notices. These give you more information about the individuals, and better yet, they give you information about other family members. To give you an example of a birth record, we have here that was taken from the Daily American in Nashville, Tennessee in 1884. It's one of my favorite notices. And when you're talking about a birth notice, this is more than just, John Smith was born. It's talking about Mr. D.A. Cole and Mr. William Ween, who were both a passenger and a freight conductor on one of the trains, and it talks about them getting their, coming home from a trip and finding that Mr. Cole has a son and that Mr. Ween has a daughter. And what's really funny about it is that they live literally next door to each other, and they were on the train together. And it's the first birth for both couples. But what's especially important for genealogical information is the fact that you have a lot in these few lines of text. You know that these two gentlemen lived side by side. You know that these are their oldest children, so it's most likely that they've only been married for a couple of years. You've got some things that you can work with to try and find additional information, all because of this sort of, interesting sideline of the fact that they were both on the train together. Sometimes you will find information you're not expecting, and it can be a little shocking. For instance, in this particular example here out of the Atlanta Constitution in 1910, now the headline says, "Child born to hides, but it dies an hour. Doctor in prison convicted of murder when child is born." It kind of makes it sound like the doctor who delivered the baby ends up in prison for murdering the child, but in fact the doctor is a Dr. Hyde, who is the father of the child, and he is apparently in prison already for murder when his wife gives birth. Unfortunately, the baby dies right away. But again, if you're looking for what happened to Dr. Hyde, and that's on your family tree, you now know that by the 2nd of September 1910, he has been incarcerated in jail, and now you've got a timeline to work back from to try and figure out what happened, or to turn your attention to other newspapers looking specifically for stories about the murder. One of the perhaps more elaborate types of resources that we'll find in information we find in the newspapers come when there's a marriage that takes place. And there may be any one of these types of entries in the newspaper: the marriage announcement, marriage license applications, engagements, wedding anniversaries. As I said, the 25th and the 50th anniversaries often list a lot of information about the couple who are celebrating that milestone wedding anniversary, in listing children, spouses, where they lived, perhaps things about when they were born, etc. And keep in mind, as you are looking at these newspaper entries, that just because you find something like an engagement or a marriage license application does not guarantee that you have a marriage. It just means that it happened. So for an engagement, we have an example here of the Bickers and Mattingly couple, again taken from the Atlanta Constitution. And Mrs. Frances Bickers and Mr. B.S. Mattingly Jr. will be their marriage will be an interesting event on Saturday, September 10th. It's taking place at noon at the Second Baptist Church. The only attendants will be the bride's sister, Mrs. W.J. Morrison, and Mr. Fred Langenfeld, and a large acquaintance will witness the ceremony. Right in that little bit there, we know that Frances has a sister who married a W.J. Morrison, and because this is 1910, we could turn our attention to the 1910 census in Atlanta to see if we could find that particular entry. We've also got, Fred Langenfeld, who's somehow, a friend or something of Mr. B.S. Mattingly. The couple's supposed to leave immediately afterwards for a wedding trip. There's supposed to be parties in their honor, etc. The key here is that the event has not yet taken place. This was mentioned in the September 2nd newspaper, and the wedding was supposed to take place on September 10th. So keep in mind that 8 days is a long time when it comes to a marriage, and maybe something happened. My grandmother probably listed, I think, the first 3 engagements for my mom. By the time of her 4th, she just gave up and stopped mentioning, and they got smaller in size as she kept breaking them off. So an engagement does not guarantee a marriage at all. Neither does a marriage license. And in the Courier Journal for Louisville, Kentucky, they would list every week those who had applied for a marriage license. One of the interesting things in Kentucky is that in this time frame you could get your marriage license in one county and go get married in another county. So sometimes having access to a newspaper and finding these entries will help you in at least narrowing down the time frame you're looking for. I do want to call attention to a couple of things here. The first off is that obviously because it's in the South, they are separating out those who were white and those who were African American. This also plays an important aspect in your research, because if you go looking for an actual marriage certificate or the marriage license, it's very likely that they have separate marriage books for the whites and the African Americans in this time frame as well. But again, if all we knew perhaps for our family was that John C. Huber and Mary were the couple that we were interested in, finding this entry for a marriage license and finding that her last name is Soof gives us some additional information. So you want to be creative in your searching. As I mentioned, wedding anniversaries, those milestone anniversaries, can be filled with a lot of information. In the New York Times, October 28, 1883, we have here that Mr. and Mrs. Harris Curtis were celebrating their 60th wedding anniversary, that it took place last evening, so October 27th is when they're reporting this, and it took place last evening, so it would have been the 26th. But it was in the house in which Mr. Curtis was born 89 years ago. Although the old gentleman has been totally blind for over 20 years, he skipped around among his guests last night in quite a lively manner. Mrs. Curtis is 80 years old and for some time has been an invalid. The celebration was in the shape of a surprise by a few friends and relatives. Refreshments were served by their 3 children, 3 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild of the couple. No death has occurred in Mr. Curtis's family since his marriage 80 years ago. On that occasion, one of the guests of the anniversary was present. The aged couple who have lived so long together received many earnest congratulations, and the party was brought to a close by the singing of Old Hundred. These 2 people are said to be the oldest couple in town. Consider for a moment all the information that we have in this wedding anniversary announcement. Most importantly, we're talking New York City, 1883, and the marriage or the birth of Mr. Curtis takes place in that household 89 years ago. We now have established that he was born in Stratford in the 1700s. There's not going to be a birth record for that. This is as close as you're going to get unless you can find a church record. Of his baptism. There's a lot of useful information in here. We also know that there hasn't been a death in his family since he got married. So in 60 years, I can skip looking for any deaths that are related to his family because they're not going to be there. We know that he has 3 children, some grandchildren, and a great-grandchild, all living as of 1883. So a lot of information housed in what looks to be a very simple entry. And this is where the meat of some of these newspaper items can be found. It's sort of, we gloss over them thinking, oh, it's just a wedding anniversary announcement. And yet, look at everything that was hiding in here. Of course, oftentimes what we turn our attention to when it comes to newspapers are when a person dies. And we're ideally hoping for an obituary, and that's going to include things like the name, the date of death, perhaps age or biography of the deceased, maybe some family information, and where and when they, where they resided, etc. Funeral notices are are much briefer. They are usually just the name, the date of death, the funeral home, and maybe burial information. And then a traditional death notice is sort of a one-liner of John Smith is dead. If you are finding lists of dead, it's probably as a result of either an epidemic or perhaps a result of war. So during the Civil War, you would see a lot of newspapers just list all of the local boys who died in battle. And as well as sometimes health reports that will say, yes, we have this epidemic, all these people died of the flu, these people were dying of smallpox, etc. So the ways in which a person's death may be mentioned can vary depending on who put the information in the newspaper and the purpose of sharing that information. In our first example here, we have the death notice of Gilbert Flagler, who died in San Francisco on the 8th of June, 1881, at the age of 100 years and 7 months. Flagler was born in St. John's, New Brunswick, but had resided in San Francisco for more than 20 years. Until recently, he had been in good health. At 98, he married again. His wife survived him. Again, a lot of information in what looks like very few words. He's dying in San Francisco, and by the way, he's dying in 1881, which means that there's not going to be a death record for him because it would have been destroyed when the earthquake hit. He's 100 years and 7 months, so we have a good idea that he was born, roughly in 1780-ish. He was born in St. John's, New Brunswick, which we probably didn't see coming, and that he has only been in San Francisco for roughly 20 years. He just married, 2 years ago. So although the marriage record may not survive because of the earthquake, perhaps something can be found in regard to his marriage through a church record. But more importantly is the fact that this particular death notice was mentioned in the Weekly Standard of Portland, Oregon. This would seem to indicate that Gilbert Flagler had some connection to Oregon. It is not unusual to find an obituary that is mentioned in a newspaper where either the family is residing or where the person themselves lived for a considerable period of time. But at the very least, the fact that it's in Portland, Oregon means that as a researcher, we need to turn our attention to Oregon and see if we can pinpoint Gilbert residing there, perhaps his children still live there, or something to that effect. In the case of a memoriam, these are usually done, I'd say anywhere from a month to a year later after a person has deceased. They are usually written by somebody other than the family. Could be the company that the person worked for, a close friend, a fraternal group that the person was associated with, and they are usually very glowing in their remarks. So it's obviously that the person was held in high esteem. One of the things, though, is that in the memoriam you will find quite a bit of information, usually biographically useful information, to help you in establishing a timeline on your ancestor. In the case of Edward P. Rudd here, we find out that he was the late head of the well-known publishing house of Rudd and Carleton. The person who submitted this memoriam knew Mr. Rudd intimately and wanted to, pay tribute to him. Gives us information that he was the son of the Reverend Mr. Rudd of Lyons in this state, which would be New York. At the early age of 15, he entered the bookhouse of J.C. Derby at Auburn, where he remained for 3 years. And so you begin to see a timeline that you can create of where he was working and therefore kind of where he was living, all within this memoriam. And this particular memoriam went on for 3 very long paragraphs talking about how wonderful this particular gentleman was. And given that it's in 1861, that's a lot of useful information, again in a time frame where a lot of states were not keeping vital records, especially death records. As I said, those are the main reasons that we go to the newspaper, is to find one of those 3. But really, if that's all you're looking for in the newspaper, you're missing out on a lot of other useful information. There are tons of other announcements that can prove very beneficial to us as genealogists. One of those is certainly the legal notices. You've got legal notices, court notices, the police blotters, as I mentioned, but you may also find tax lists or jury lists. And some of the items may be news stories rather than, you know, a set list of people. And they may also be listed either in a column or just as filler. Keep in mind that newspapers have to fill all their space, so if they've got 3 inches of space they need to fill, they may say, oh yeah, we're going to use this particular little story. So you have to be creative in looking at the newspapers. Among the types of legal notices that you're likely to find are things like a divorce. Now, this particular divorce is taking place in 1858, and the entry is in the Democratic Pharos of Logansport, Indiana. Keep in mind, 1858 is not a time when we have no-fault divorce. You can't just go in and say, I don't like him anymore. There has to be a reason in most instances. What this is going to mean is that there should be some useful information in the divorce record, because whoever is suing for divorce is going to have to bring in witnesses to say why this marriage should be terminated. And usually what would happen is, as you can see here, they would post it in the newspaper to alert the other person that yes, this is going to take place and the action is going to be heard and determined whether or not the other part of the couple shows up. In this particular case, it is Margaretta Jane Smith who has apparently flown the coop, because regardless of whether or not she shows up, they are going to go ahead and make a determination in her absence and the exact date. Now, this may have been published 3 or 4 times and in multiple newspapers if they were attempting to locate where that person was from. But that gives you the date that the divorce hearing was going to take place, in this case Monday the 19th day of April 1858, and more importantly gives us a county courthouse, because we are in Cass County, allowing us to then turn our attention to the court records to find the divorce record, to find out what happened, to see what witnesses can't come forward, because the witnesses have to tell how long they've known the people, etc. And so you may get useful information about when and where certain, one or the other of these people were born, when and where they married, things that maybe you were having trouble finding. So again, the divorces in this time frame can be full of useful information. When we think of an elopement, we tend to think of people running away to get married. In the 1700s, an elopement was usually in the case of one, generally speaking, the female, running off either alone or with another man. And because of the way in which the laws were written at the time, the husband needed to let everybody know that he was no longer going to be responsible for her debts. And so they would call these elopements, and he would put in the newspaper that because she has left, and because she left without any provocation on his part, he is no longer going to be responsible for her debts. And he's giving public notice that as of this first day of July 1758, that's it. If she incurs any expenses and says, oh, my husband will pay for it, he's not going to, because she's basically run off and left him, and he does not want to be responsible for that. Again, she may never actually seek a divorce in this case. We're talking the 1700s. She may just up and disappear, but at the very least you know that she has disappeared because of the fact that this entry is in the Pennsylvania Gazette. And these are quite common in the colonies in this time frame. Anytime somebody left, again, usually the female, occasionally you'll see that she ran off with somebody and that guy will be named as well. We wouldn't want to, protect anybody here, especially the guilty. So again, it gives you a timeline or gives you an understanding of why all of a sudden Benjamin is single or remarrying or something. When it comes to the courts, similar to the divorce, we often find that different courts will have a blotter that gets published. In this particular instance from the Courier-Journal in Louisville, Kentucky, they would take each of the courts, the city court, the circuit court, the common law and equity court, who was the judge of the day, and what did he, what kind of issues did he hear, and what happened to them. So up under the city court, we see that there's a disorderly conduct, and one was continued, and a few were dismissed. We've drunken disorderly conduct. One guy got fined, another was dismissed. And so each time you get a sense of what's going on. These court notices, though, sometimes there's even a column called Gossip of the Courts, and you may be able to track what's going on in a court case. So if you find your person is being continued, or there's an amendment or something of those lines, what may be is that you're going to fill in the gaps in a court record because the records have been destroyed, misplaced, whatever, with these court notices. Another very useful item that you find in the newspapers are the jury lists. They're going to list the people who have to serve, and keep in mind that it's kind of like jury duty today, only instead of 3 days or one court case or whatever your rules are wherever you are, maybe they had to serve for the entire month. And so as we see here in this first example, for the August term of 1830, we have each township and the 2 gentlemen who have to serve, or 1 gentleman, depending on the size of the area, who has to serve for the jury for that time frame. And the same thing over in the larger example for a general jury. And so these would have been people who would have gone to the county courthouse and done their service. So if there was a court case that came up, they'd go in and they'd do their thing. Not like today where everybody gets called for a day or so. And again, this allows us some understanding of not just a county where our family was living, but a very specific township in which they were living. And since these jury lists are published every month, you could perhaps find where, 1 year your guy is living in this particular town, 2 years later he's living in another town, and if that's taking place between census years or at a time when the census records perhaps didn't give the specific township names, then you've got, again, additional information. So voter lists and tax lists are another way of helping you isolate your ancestor, but they can help you in determining when your ancestor came of age. Keep in mind that the tax man always finds you, and generally speaking, as soon as a young gentleman became of age, he owns a horse, he's going to get taxed on that horse. They may help you in determining when your ancestor died or moved, because they're going to be on these lists and then they're going to disappear off them. Some of them will even indicate in the list that so-and-so died. In the example of the tax list that we have here, we've got and sadly, I wish I could tell you that some of them are that this is a bad example. Sadly, a lot of newspapers, this is exactly what they look like. They're very hard to read, predominantly because it's newsprint. Newsprint breaks down quickly, and depending on what resources they had when they were microfilming, which is largely where we're getting these, is microfilm newspapers that have then been perhaps digitized if we can find them online. And so here we have Thomas O'Mara, we have where he's living, the size of his house, because of course he's got to pay tax on it. Then we have 3 Thomas O'Maras listed, and then there's a Thomas J. O'Mara. So 4 Thomas O'Maras on this tax list, but the information held for each of the locations of where that person is residing may help us in the kind of differentiating between our Thomas and other Thomases living in the area. They may also help you in, again, determining if somebody moves out of the area, because if you've been following them every year in the tax lists and then boom, all of a sudden they disappear, and you want to make sure that it's just they didn't get missed for a year. You want to make sure you've gone like 3 or 4 years past that, but you want to have a sense of every year where your person is, and tax lists can be a useful resource. And if they haven't been microfilmed, the actual tax lists themselves, perhaps your alternative is these newspaper lists instead. Sheriff notices. These usually come about when somebody has defaulted on their land. In many cases, it is where the sheriff is going to auction off the house and the property because somebody is deceased or they've defaulted and there are debts that cannot be paid. As a result, you get a lot of information about where the writ is being filed, so the courthouse where it's being filed, the county. You may also get a good, reliable land description, including surrounding people. So in other words, the houses or the land that butts up against your ancestors. And that may help you in better identifying your person, or you may all of a sudden discover that in the land record that just had meets and had like rectangular survey, that because they're doing this and you're getting the surrounding lands, you all of a sudden discover, well, that's where he found his wife. She lived one farm over. Those types of things. But again, it's perhaps because some of these are coming online and searchable that you may find information that you didn't realize was out there, and that allows you to then turn your attention to other records such as land or court records. Another useful notice that you find is anything having to do with an estate. In this particular case, we have an administrator's notice. Parties indebted to the estate of D.H. Maypother or Hart and Maypother are requested to come forward and settle at once, and parties to whom the estate is indebted are requested to have their claims properly proven and presented to Thomas O'Mara, the administrator. This was in the Courier-Journal in Louisville in 1874. D.H. Maypother had died earlier, I believe it was in June of 74, and in his will he actually listed his wife as his executor. She said thanks but no thanks, so then the courts had to step in and appoint an administrator. What this told me, though, was, well, that was how she came to marry this particular man. So the widow of D.H. Maypother marries Thomas O'Mara. This is how she comes in contact with him as he becomes the administrator. So he's dealing with her frequently, and then they ultimately get married. The gossip and society news, do not assume that your people will not be in this type of news information, especially if it's a small town newspaper. The smaller the locality of the newspaper, the more little pieces of information you get. It could be, you know, that school started and everybody who's in every grade, that the new teacher has come to town, whatever it is, but it doesn't have to just be the rich and famous who are going to be in the gossip and society news. It could be comings and goings. It could be anything like that. You just never know what you're going to find in these news items. And in the case of the gossip, you may want to follow up on other records. As I mentioned at one point earlier, there sometimes is something called the gossip of the courts, and it's literally, that's what the column is called, the gossip of the courts. And in tracking a particular divorce, that was how I was able to fill in some of the pieces, because not all of the divorce record survives. And so I had bits and pieces of the divorce record from the court, and then the newspaper filled in sort of the backstabbing and biting and yelling and screaming that was going on between the two parties, to the point where the judge actually sanctioned them. None of that was actually in the divorce court record that I was able to get, but I found that in the newspapers. And so you may be able to fill up new information, or you may want to take that information that you're finding in the newspaper and look at the other records to verify accuracy. When it comes to the social events and the society news, again, don't assume that your ancestor won't be mentioned here. He doesn't necessarily have to be some rich guy who, you know, is going off to see the president. You often have people who, if they've resided in an area for a very long time, who are going off to visit their children who've moved across the country or something, that may be mentioned in what they call the social events and the society news for that area. Society in this term meant just the people who lived in that community. And so it was any kind of news that was of interest to the individuals living in that town. Comings and goings, the town residents, the new teacher arriving, as I said. Could be something as simple as, oh, you know, Jane Smith is going on a trip. She'll be gone for 3 weeks. Those types of things. Today, think in terms of Facebook. We post things like, oh, going on a vacation trip. Same kind of thing, only it was in the newspaper. Another very useful information that you will find in the newspaper is your meetings and organizations. Our ancestors were joiners on a number of different levels. They went to churches, they joined communities, organizations, whether they be fraternal or whatever. And so if you can identify those organizations that were active, especially the fraternal groups, and just what the local group, lodge, whatever they called it was, this may lead you to other records. Also, these types of groups give us insight into the times, especially for things like the temperance movements, women's suffrage, and things like that. Very often in the newspaper, you would find a list of the meetings that took place and where they were meeting. And so, as our example shows, you would see the meetings tonight. So the Tuscarora tribe, number 29, IORM, that very first entry that we have up at the top of this example. Well, first let me explain that the IORM is the Improved Order of Redmond. This particular organization, while they admired the Native American thinking and the beauty of the, I guess, the pageantry, if you want, for lack of a better term, they actually didn't let Native Americans join until the 1970s. But we have the tribe in this case, which allows us then to go to the state's lodge, the state level, and ask for information about a particular individual because we now have that tribe. Or in the case of the next one down, the Larkin Lodge, number 78, Knights of Pythias. Again, knowing the lodge or the, and each of your organizations, if they were the Redmond, they had tribes. If they were the Knights of Pythias, they had lodges like the Masons have lodges. If they were based on, owls or some other bird, then they may be called aviaries. It's all dependent on how their particular group was, what they considered their focus. But you have to know what the local item is. And so this can help you in identifying that. If you don't know what was your local lodge for your particular ancestor, what you can see is that they would tell you where they meet. So the Knights of Pythias here were meeting at Dyer's Building on 3rd and Market Streets. If there were multiple lodges, if it were a big city, you may look to see what each lodge was that existed in the city and start with the one that was closest to where your ancestor resided. This gives you just a hint of some of the information that you're likely to find in the newspapers. But there are many different types of newspapers, and these can play a role in what information is included and the focus of that newspaper. So why are they going to write, what are they going to write about and why? And this can be in their length and in their focus as far as any number of things. The various types of newspapers kind of can be cataloged in this way. You've got your dailies, your weeklies, and your monthlies, your ethnic press, your religious press, and then your trade press. Obviously, each of these types of newspapers is going to have a different focus and a different reason for existing. The dailies, the weeklies, the monthlies, these are what we traditionally use. These would be the newspapers that we still know today. And there may have been a daily at the large city level, a weekly or a monthly at the small town level or the county level if it was a rural area. But the other presses were obviously very focused on something specific, whether it be the ethnicity in the area, the religion that was the most predominant in the area, or occupation, trade union, etc. So each one is going to have a different focus, but that means you may get different information about your ancestor in all of these different versions. When it comes to the ethnic newspapers, one of the things that they did was they gave you news of the old country. It was written in the native tongue of the for the people of that ethnicity, and they were also designed to help Americanize new immigrants. So they would help to lead them through the steps of becoming naturalized, whatever. But more importantly, they often indicated information about the old country for those individuals. So there may have been a column about the hometown where the bulk of the people in that particular area resided, and that may help clue you into where your ancestor resided before coming to America, which when you get to European research becomes paramount, because you really do need to know a town in order to effectively research over there. Native Americans also had newspapers, and in some instances they may have contained information about the tribes people, but they may have had both American English and the language of the Native American tribe itself. So you could find both information, and they may have had certain columns where they did them in both languages. But again, it's going to be about the people of that specific tribe or community or reservation when it eventually became that. So they give you the details of life for what it was like to live as a Cherokee or a Dakota or whatever. Again, very useful information in researching our family. The military and labor newspapers, again, their focus is on the people who were in that military service. In this case, the Quantico Sentry. It's going to tell me about things like the Marines and people who are retiring from the military, the rifle shooting gains, etc. All of that information may help me in isolating my ancestor and determining when and where he joined the military, etc. Labor newspapers, such as the Industrial Worker, again, their focus was on occupation, on banding together to form unions and things like that. And those can help us in maybe identifying, unfortunately, at a certain period of time, that all of a sudden our ancestor has an FBI file because he was being investigated because he received the Industrial Worker, which was considered to be a it was considered to be a communist type newspaper. So if we could find our information about our ancestor in such a newspaper, again, there are other records that may exist that give us information about our ancestor. So now that we've talked a little bit about those, where do we find our information? Well, quickly we're going to go into effective newspaper searching and then finding those newspapers. Again, look in the gossip portion of the paper. Know that the township where your ancestor resided, that there may be a separate section in the newspaper by township, suburb, or community. The towns often had more than one newspaper. You want to check 10, 20, 25, 50 years after a big event to see if they've reprinted it. Some papers that were published in the larger communities would have a special edition or an afternoon edition and an evening edition. That may mean that there's different information from the afternoon or the morning edition to the evening edition, additional information about perhaps an ongoing court case. You want to look for things like notices of ship arrivals. Sometimes passengers were listed there, or naturalizations, hotel guests if there was somebody coming in, unclaimed letters at the post office. This was very often mentioned in newspapers. Your tax lists, your juror crimes, moves, etc. And the orphan trains. If you had somebody who ended up out west, you're looking at northeastern newspapers for those orphan trains. Letters to the editor and classified ads were also used to seek information about missing relatives and friends, and so those may clue you in as well. Identifying the newspapers can sometimes be the hardest thing, and so we turn to things like union lists and bibliographies and newspapers on microfilm, the Early American Newspapers Project, and of course the internet. The first go-to, if it's an early newspaper, is Clarence S. Brigham's History and Bibliography of American Newspapers, 1690 to 1820. And what he did is he arranges them by name of the item based on the state, the city or town, and then the title of the publication, and then what years it ran. If it was morphed into another name, he will indicate that within his write-up. And then at the time that he published this, he indicated if a particular organization had some of the newspapers. So as we see here for the Boston Weekly Rehearsal, the Massachusetts Historical Society had certain issues of that particular newspaper. Obviously, in today's information, that may no longer be true, but at the very least, what I use this particular resource for is identifying a newspaper that existed in this early time frame before newspaper publishing was all the rage. For later and subsequent and larger coverings of the United States and international, I use newspapers in microform, which is through the Library of Congress. And it will give a variety of things. So here we have the Courier Journal, and it gives the year that it started and if it had an end date. And then there are a bunch of abbreviations you see below. These are to repositories that have this newspaper on microfilm. What that means is that you could perhaps get them requested through interlibrary loan to your local public library and be able to go through them yourself. So when it comes to finding the newspapers, you know, ideally we wish they were all online. A large number are, but we really have to turn to a number of different repositories. And these include libraries, archives, state and local historical societies, the newspaper morgues of those that are still in business, online, and some printed sources as well. I mentioned earlier the Early American Newspaper Project. This was done by the Redex Corporation, and it was based on Clarence S. Brigham's volume. And the goal was to microfilm all of those newspapers for preservation. And that project may be in your local larger library on microfilm. But one of the things is that the Early American Newspaper Project is now online through Newsbank as a subscription service through institutions. And we here at NEHGS have this particular item. If you come in on site, you may find that your local public library has subscribed to this Early American Newspaper Project as well. And these are going to be the very early, you know, 1820 on back, so very early newspapers. When it comes to some of the resources we have here at NEHGS, we have indexes to Boston Transcript obits, and this is for the entire run of the Boston Transcript, so from 1875 to 1930. The Columbian Sentinel, we have an index to the marriages and the deaths, and the Columbian Sentinel ran from the late 1700s to about 1840. But other NEHGS resources that we have available for newspapers are some things like the Missing Friends database, searching for Irish people who came over. There was a publication called the Boston Pilot, and the notices from that that dealt with the Irish who were looking for their family and friends has been incorporated into a database that can be searched on our website as members. We also have, through remote access, so wherever you are living, as long as you're a member of NEHGS, you can access what's known as the 19th century U.S. newspapers. A couple of on-site items would be the Boston Globe, that's on-site access. I already talked about the Early American Newspapers. On microfilm, we have the Boston Pilot, which was much more than just the Missing Friends notices. It's actually a newspaper for Catholics in Boston. We also have the Boston Transcript and the Columbian Sentinel. And then recently, the American Jewish Historical Society, here based with us at here in Boston, has digitized the Jewish Times, and that's another resource. Digitized newspapers are obviously what we're hoping for because they're easy to find. So some of the, obviously, the most common places to look for them would be places like Ancestry.com. Cindy's List has an entire section devoted to newspapers. There's genealogybank.com that is a subscription site. Google News, news.google.com/newspapers. It's kind of hidden. They no longer make it easy to find, but there's a lot of good newspapers there that have been digitized that are not just US based, and you can go through issue by issue. Newspapers.com is another subscription site. And then a couple of really useful published resources for finding these digitized newspapers are Claudia C. Braylen's Searching for Your Ancestors in Historic Newspapers and Ernest Thode's Historic German Newspapers Online, which we'll talk about in a second. But quickly, we'll just show you what each of these digitized newspaper sites kind of look like and where you can find the information. So in the newspapers on Ancestry.com, if you look under search records and you go to search all records, over on the right you'll see one that specifically says historic newspapers. And then you'll notice that you can browse and filter by the specific locality and the types of dates that they have available, such as for the US, 1900 to 1999. Now that's obviously not going to be for every newspaper, although we wish it would be. Cindy'sList.com has an alphabetical listing of newspapers. She also has under each of the states in the US and some of the countries a subject heading for newspapers. But if you know the title of your newspaper, you could use these alphabetical listings to try and identify an online avenue for that newspaper. As I mentioned, genealogybank.com is another subscription site. They have predominantly their great use right now is their obituaries from 77 to present, because if you're trying to track what happened to the children of a particular family, this can be a good resource. But you'll notice that they also have something called the newspaper archives. These are the historical newspapers that they've been able to access. And news.google.com newspapers, as I said, a lot of things hiding in here. You'll not find this easily without this URL, so this might be one of those screens that you take a little camera picture of, because it's got tons of information, including the Boston transcript up to 1915, available for free. That's the benefit here. These are all for free on the Google site. And then a more recent entry into the newspapers is newspapers.com that allows you to search. Again, it's a subscriber database. They are adding more and more things to it. You can narrow by locality, etc., as you get into it. I mentioned two published resources that can help lead you to online resources, searching for your ancestors in historic newspapers, and we've just got an example here, the digitized newspaper collection for the Connecticut State Library newspaper collections, and then they've got what's called a tiny URL. It's a way of having a URL that fits on one line, and if you type that in, it will take you to the actual entry, which in this case was the Connecticut State Library Newspapers of Connecticut, allowing you information about how to use the collection, browse the titles, etc. And this has been done for each state in that particular volume, as well as some international items. If your research is German, then Ernest Thode's recent Historic German Newspapers Online is a gold mine, and it's not just foreign newspapers, but also newspapers, ethnic newspapers here in the US for the Germans. And again, he has done his a little differently because there are so many of them. So you get the title of the newspaper, you get the dates of the newspaper, and then you get a key code. And at the front of the book is a list of all of these key codes that tells you the website or the area that you have to go to access these online. And so one of those happens to be the records of the Austrian archive. And we don't think in terms of Austria when we think of Germany, but there are a number of resources that have been digitized, and they give you the time frames, the title, and then how often or frequently it ran, or how many issues they may have available. Keep in mind that these newspapers come and go quickly in some instances, and if you're dealing with newspapers in Europe, they're likely to be in the foreign language of whatever the country is in question. Effective newspaper research needs to be done with keeping in mind that the newspapers that have been digitized have likely been OCR'd, and that means that if they're the older newspapers from the 1700s, you're maybe better off going page by page in an issue because of the way in which the computer read that information. It may not index it as well as we would like. When you're using a search engine such as newspapers.com, genealogy bank, whatever, remember less is best. Start with the least amount of information, and then if you get tons of hits, then you may want to narrow that down to a little bit more, but do it very judiciously as you're working through it. So quick review of a lot of information that we just went through. Newspapers are a window to the past. They're available in many different formats, and not everything is online. I wish it was, but that's just, we're not there yet. They tend to not be indexed. Google.com's newspapers, a lot of it is pretty much you're going to go page by page, and that's my effective way of saying, okay, I've really looked at this newspaper. But they can answer all sorts of questions and open new research avenues. So by all means, you want to embrace newspapers and go forward with that type of research.
All right, thank you, Rhonda, for your presentation. So let's tackle your questions. If you have anything that you'd like to ask, please go ahead and type it in the question panel, and we'll answer as many as we can in the time provided. We just have a few minutes, but I know there were a lot of questions, so we could maybe extend the hour a bit. So Roberta asks, do you ever question the accuracy of newspaper articles, knowing that today's stories are not always completely accurate?
Absolutely. One of the things that you will quickly discover with the newspapers is that just like today, many of them are biased. In other words, you may have the local Whig or whatever. Keep in mind that the title often will clue you into that bias. And so if you're looking at a particular story about something that took place and it's a Republican newspaper against a Democrat or vice versa, there may be some bias there. Also, when it comes to things like obituaries, remember, we're looking at something that was supplied by somebody still alive. The deceased person did not usually supply their own obituary, so the information is only based on what the living know. So again, grain of salt.
Thanks. Now, Alan asks, how do you find copies of past newspapers that may be out of business or merged with other papers over time? How do you go about locating those?
Depending on the time frame in question, the first thing I would do is look at either Clarence Brigham's Bibliography if it's pre-1820. If it's any other time like after that, I would turn to that Library of Congress newspapers in microform. If you Google newspapers in microform, I guarantee you that the top hit will take you straight to the PDFs. They're huge. They're broken into 3 sections, and it's based on each state and then the towns in each state. And we'll give you the information on the run and who had things, but at the very least you'll learn that this newspaper started out as this name, then it merged with this one, and so forth, and where it might be on microfilm.
Great. Now Robert asks, how accurate or inaccurate is OCR indexing?
OCR indexing can be grossly inaccurate. And so when I get people here who come in and say, I've exhausted the newspapers, or I've exhausted the census, or whatever it is, if it's been OCR'd, I tell them to define exhausted, and if they tell me they just did a computer search, they have not exhausted it. Page by page is exhausting a newspaper, and sometimes that's what it comes down to. You saw some of the examples I had and how difficult they were to read. The computer's not going to have much better luck at it. And so it sometimes does come down to us actually going in and looking at it page by page. So don't assume that because you didn't find it in a computer index search that it doesn't exist.
Now, Mary Jo is asking for some suggestions, especially for working with a newspaper that's unwilling to share an early newspaper. I guess they don't allow genealogists access. Do you have any suggestions for either circumventing that or maybe finding another resource?
For a newspaper that's not willing to share, my first thing would be to turn my attention to the Library of Congress list and see if it was microfilmed at some point. It was published. The microfilm didn't necessarily come from the newspapers they have in their morgue. It may have come from the newspapers that existed in a university library, a public library. And so there may be one that exists, you just don't know about it yet because it's held in Timbuktu somewhere and you'll have to get it on interlibrary loan. That would be my first go-to. If it is a local newspaper for a specific area, see if the public library has back issues of it as well. And you may have to hire a researcher to go in and look at them, but they are probably held somewhere in somewhere else besides just the newspaper.
All right, now let's see, Mary has a question regarding tax lists. Would those typically be organized by resident or by property? So in the case of Thomas O'Mara, the example that you had in your presentation, could it be that one person owned 3 properties and that was the listing, or is it typically by individual resident?
You'll have to look at the actual how they have them arranged. So one of the things that you'll want to do is take somebody you know really well and find out if he had 3 properties, if all 3 of them are listed separately or together. In Thomas O'Mara's case, in the example I gave you, those 3 Thomas O'Maras that did not have a J in their name, they were all the same individual. He owned a business, he owned a house, and then I believe he even owned like a warehouse. And so those were all 3 his items, and they were separately arranged. Some will do it by legal land description and then list the name later. You have to look and see and get a familiarity with the arrangement, and that may result in you having to maybe do a little additional research if you see multiples like that.
Now, a few people are asking about paid newspaper sites. How do they compare? Do you like one more than the other? What suggestions do you have for people who are interested in subscribing to a certain site?
The age-old which one is best. And my cop-out answer is the one that has my ancestor in it. However, with that said, Ancestry.com is, I believe, technically owns newspapers.com. So usually if you are subscribed to Fold 3 or Ancestry, you may find that you can get a cheaper deal on newspapers.com. It is not the same information that's on Ancestry. So their focus is on nothing but newspapers, whereas Ancestry is on a lot of other things. Genealogybank.com, again, right now, their main focus or their best use is more contemporary obituaries or the really older things that you may be looking for. They sort of feed the gap between early American newspapers and the more present day where everything is sort of digitized and available. Try them for a little while. Try them on a monthly basis and pound on them on things that you know should be in the newspapers and see what gives you what you need, because every person has their ancestors in different places, and one site may have that particular place well done, and because they've got it, the other guy can't have it, kind of thing.
All right, we're almost out of time, so maybe just a few more questions. A few people have mentioned in the comments old Fulton postcard fultonhistory.com. Have you ever used that site? Do you recommend it?
I have used Old Fulton. I do recommend it for the area, for what they have, and it's certainly one of the places that I check. Sometimes it's not as easy to use search-wise, but the information they have there has improved over the years. I mean, I've been using it since it first came out. So there's a lot of good things there. Again, what we gave you here was sort of highlights. The point is to, set you forth and go crazy. The Library of Congress listing, if you can identify the title of your newspaper, then finding it in a digitized format may be easier because you can Google that title and maybe something like Old Fulton would come up.
All right, and one final question. Carol asks, what are the copyright guidelines when using clips from newspapers on my website?
Generally speaking, copyright, will the newspaper go out and sue you? Probably not. I would say, I would strongly suggest that you stick to the pre-1928 items. If you're pre-1928, pretty much everything is in the public domain per se. Even books are in the public domain for that time frame. And for most of us, that's the newspapers that we're going to be relying on the most would be those. If it's an occasional obituary or something on your ancestor, nobody's going to come after you for that. If it's somebody's photograph in the newspaper, that they might come after you for because that's maybe the one and only image of that incident or whatever. But obituaries, tax lists, some of those types of things, nobody's going to come after you for them.
All right, thank you everyone for your questions. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today, but if you'd like hands-on help with your research or have more detailed questions about the specifics of your research, you may want to consider scheduling a consultation or even hiring our research services team. If you're interested in learning more about either of those services, you can write to the email addresses on the current slide, but I'll also include that information in my follow-up email to you tomorrow. So thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.